It was past midnight when Julian Ward returned to the 48th floor of Ward International, his office glowing faintly under motion sensor lights. The building should have been silent, empty, asleep like the rest of New York, but a sound stopped him in the hallway. A voice, soft, deliberate, unmistakably female, reciting something that didn't sound like English. His hand froze on the door handle. Italian? No French. No, wait. He caught a rhythm, a roll of consonants too fluid, too sharp. It was German, then Spanish, then Russian. Julian narrowed his eyes, following the sound toward the glass conference room. Inside, a young woman was standing on a stepladder, cleaning the interior of a floor-to-ceiling window, headphones slung around her neck, muttering aloud with her eyes closed, as if trying to memorize something. Her lips moved rapidly, switching tongues mid-sentence like flipping pages in a multilingual book. Her accent shifted with precision, her posture relaxed but focused, like this was muscle memory. Her brown hair was pulled into a loose braid, wisps curling against her temple. Her janitor's uniform was standard navy cotton, simple cut, but the way she carried herself was anything but ordinary. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, silently, as if any noise might shatter the moment. She didn't see him, or if she did, she didn't acknowledge it. She finished wiping the window, stepped down carefully, and started gathering her supplies, still whispering in another language he couldn't quite place. Romanian? Arabic? He wasn't sure, but what he was sure of without question was that this woman was not just a cleaner. No one spoke like that casually. No one drifted from French to Korean in the span of 30 seconds unless they had once lived a very different life. Julian leaned back against the hallway wall, arms crossed, observing her in stillness. She didn't perform. She wasn't putting on a show. She thought she was alone, and somehow that made her 10 times more intriguing. He glanced at his watch, 2:14 a.m. He had come back to retrieve the China merger brief for tomorrow's board meeting, but suddenly, that felt like the second most important thing happening on this floor. When the woman finally looked up and noticed him, her entire body stilled. Her eyes widened, not with panic, but with something closer to resignation. She straightened, gripped her cleaning caddy tighter, and cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly, in crisp English. "I didn't know anyone was still here." Julian didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch a beat longer than polite. Then finally he asked, "How many languages was that?" Her brows knit. "Excuse me?" "You were speaking," he said. "I counted at least 6, probably more." "How many?" She hesitated, clearly uncertain whether this was an accusation or a compliment. 9, she said after a moment, "but some are rusty." Julian studied her, something unreadable flickering behind his gray eyes. "What's your name?" "Ava," she replied. "Ava Lynn." He repeated it once in his mind, then again aloud, testing how it felt in his mouth. It felt significant. "You clean here every night?" She nodded. "Only floors 40 through 50. "Right," he said, as if mentally filing the detail away. Then after a pause, he added, "You should go home. It's late." She dipped her head and turned to leave, but before she passed him, Julian said one last thing, not cold, not harsh, but quietly curious. "Ava, why is someone like you mopping floors at 2 a.m? She didn't look back. She only replied, gently and without self-pity, "Because speaking 9 languages doesn't pay rent when no one's listening." And then she was gone, leaving behind a streak-free window and a CEO who, for the first time in years, realized he'd just heard something worth remembering. Ava Lynn hadn't always been invisible. There was a time, not too long ago, when her voice carried across classrooms, when professors called on her not just for answers, but for nuance. She had once been the girl who spoke 9 languages before the age of 23, who won national academic competitions, who was offered a full-ride scholarship to study comparative linguistics at Columbia. But none of that survived her mother's sudden illness. None of that held up when the bills came faster than the scholarships, when her father disappeared with what little savings they had, and the only thing left to protect her 12-year-old sister from being thrown into the same foster system Ava herself had aged out of was Ava. She withdrew from school before her final semester. Quietly, no farewell, no fanfare. She applied for every job she could without a degree, and the only one that responded immediately was the late-night custodial crew for Ward International. It wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. Ava told herself it was temporary. A stepping stone, a chapter she'd rewrite later. But weeks became months, and the girl who once dreamed of translating for diplomats was now scrubbing ink stains from glass walls and picking up discarded business cards with foreign names she recognized, names she could have spoken to in their own language if anyone had asked. But no one did, so she kept her head down, earbuds in, whispering phrases in Dutch and Korean to keep her brain alive. Languages were the only things she could still afford. They were free, after all, and if she didn't practice them, she feared they'd wither inside her like the rest of the life she'd put on hold. Julian Ward, on the other hand, had built his life out of precision. He rose from nothing, an orphan from the docks of Boston, who taught himself Mandarin before 16 and closed his first international logistics deal before 25. Now, at 36, he commanded a multinational empire and rarely looked over his shoulder. He was respected, feared, envied, but never truly known. He kept his private life off the grid, his interviews brief, his boardroom tone glacial. To the world, he was composed genius. To those beneath him, he was unreachable altitude. But even the most polished marble can hold a fracture. For Julian, it was trust. Years ago, he had been engaged to a French-Russian interpreter, a brilliant woman named Celeste, who had helped him secure a major government contract in Eastern Europe. She had been everything Ava was not: charming, seductive, media-trained, and ruthless. And she had betrayed him, not just emotionally, but professionally. She leaked sensitive documents to a competitor in exchange for equity and left him with a fractured board, a near lawsuit, and a heart that refused to admit it had ever been broken. Since then, Julian compartmentalized everything: intellect above instinct, power above proximity, feelings filed away in folders, never reopened. Until the night he heard a woman reciting poetry in Arabic while Windexing a boardroom window. There was something about Ava that disrupted the algorithm. She wasn't just intelligent. She was quiet in a way that didn't demand attention but earned it. She had presence, not performance, and when she spoke, even casually, her tone carried that distinct texture only those who lived deeply and survived privately possessed. Julian spent the rest of that week reviewing merger documents in his office well past midnight, but it wasn't about the numbers anymore. It was about patterns, routine, and perhaps, if he was honest with himself, the faint hope that she would be there again, tidying corners, whispering forgotten dialects into the air, like secrets no one had asked her to keep. Ava noticed. Of course, she did. The sudden increase in CEO presence on her floor wasn't subtle. She'd spent years analyzing behavior, inflection, body language. She saw the way he paused longer when passing her, how he glanced her way when she wasn't supposed to be looking, but she didn't acknowledge it. That would break the spell. And, besides, what could come of it? He was the man whose initials were stitched into the very carpet she vacuumed. She was the girl who collected half-used pens from discarded conference folders so her sister could have school supplies. Still, she couldn't deny the way her heart reacted the next time she turned a corner and found him leaning casually against the window, arms crossed, watching her without a trace of apology. And when he said, "You Missed a spot. With the smallest twitch of a smile, she found herself laughing softly just once, then shaking her head and replying, "You don't seem like the kind of man who notices details like that." To which he answered, "Only the important ones." It wasn't flirting, not exactly, but it was something. Ava went home that night with the echo of his words tangled somewhere between her ribs, and for the first time in months she didn't recite languages in her sleep. She dreamt in silence, dreamt of a man who stood still long enough to hear her voice without asking her to translate it into something easier to understand. By the following week, Julian no longer bothered to pretend his late nights were necessary. He had long since optimized his calendar, trained his staff to operate independently, and set up decision funnels so precise they could run on autopilot for days. But none of that explained why he found himself alone in the office after midnight, 3 nights in a row, casually reviewing proposals he'd already approved, watching the security camera feed of the janitorial team flicker across his monitor as if waiting for something more than movement. She arrived at 12:08 a.m. each night, always punctual, always quiet, always in that navy uniform with the sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows. He admired that consistency, the ritual of it. She moved with purpose, her body speaking a language even more fluent than her tongue. Restraint, grace, invisibility honed through necessity. On the 4th night, he didn't wait in his office. He stepped out, stood by the glass railing overlooking the main atrium where she always started first. She didn't notice him at first. She was adjusting the height of a mop handle, earbuds in, one hand moving in rhythm with the music only she could hear. He heard it faintly when he stepped closer, old jazz, French, subtle, elegant like her. "That's Aznavour," he said, not loud, but enough. She looked up sharply, surprise flickering through her expression before she pulled out an earbud. "You know French music?" "I spent 6 months in Paris negotiating a port acquisition. The music was the only part I liked. I thought CEOs didn't have time for music. We don't, but we remember things that haunt us." "And does this song haunt you?" "No," he said, eyes steady on hers. "But you do." She blinked. His voice hadn't changed volume, but it shifted something in the room. She recovered quickly. "That's a dangerous thing to say to someone holding bleach." His lips curved slightly. "And yet, I trust you." She didn't smile, but her eyes did. She returned to mopping, slower now, the rhythm different. Julian didn't leave. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and watched her finish the floor like it was a performance. When she gathered her supplies and passed by him to reach the next hallway, he asked, "Ava, what language do you dream in?" She paused. "Depends on the dream." "And nightmares?" She hesitated longer this time. "Those don't need language." It wasn't a flirtation. It was an intimacy deeper than that, a question only someone who knew silence could ask. After that night, they spoke more. Never long, never planned, but with each exchange, the space between them shortened. Once, she translated a quote from a Persian poet for him. Once, he brought her a coffee, without saying a word, simply placing it beside her cart with a sticky note. "Black. No sugar. Like your sense of humor." She never asked how he knew. He never explained. Their relationship became its own dialect, quiet, precise, understood only by them. Then came the incident. A client from Argentina arrived unannounced at the building after hours, lost in the maze of conference rooms. Security was delayed. Ava, finishing the 47th floor, heard him shouting in rapid Spanish into a phone. Without hesitating, she approached calmly, asked in fluent Argentine dialect if he needed assistance. The man froze, startled, then smiled in relief. Within minutes, she guided him to the executive suite, offered water, and even translated a message into English for his assistant. Julian arrived, just as she was finishing. He didn't interrupt. He watched the man thank her profusely, bow slightly, and step into the elevator. When it was just them again, Julian walked to her slowly. "You just saved us $100,000 deal," he said. "I didn't do anything. You spoke his language when no one else could. You made him feel seen. That's what language is supposed to do. Then why aren't you doing it for a living?" She looked at him, her jaw tightening. "Because I live in a world where resumes matter more than fluency, and janitor uniforms make people forget you can read." He was silent, then very quietly, "I didn't forget." "No," she said just as quietly. "But you're not most people." That night, she left before he did, and for the first time, he found himself unsettled by the emptiness she left behind. Her voice still echoed down the halls, in Portuguese, then Mandarin, then fading into the hum of the city beyond the windows. He stared out at the skyline for a long time, thinking not of contracts or quarterly projections, but of Ava Lynn and of all the things she never said aloud that he was beginning to understand anyway. The next morning, Julian arrived at the office earlier than usual, not because of urgency, but because of clarity. He stood at the edge of the executive suite's war room, a space used only for the highest-level decisions, and spread out a set of documents on the table. They weren't mergers or acquisition proposals. They were transcripts, multi-language contract drafts, and legal documents tied to a complicated logistics project in Singapore that had stalled for months due to poor translations and miscommunications. It wasn't a test. It wasn't a trap. It was a door, and he knew exactly who he wanted to see walk through it. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and the staff thinned out, Julian waited. Ava appeared like clockwork, uniform pressed, earbuds in, mop cart rolling softly across the polished floor. When she reached the hallway, near the war room, she paused. Julian was already there, the door open, papers neatly arranged inside. "I need a favor," he said, voice low and firm. She eyed him cautiously. "I'm not trained in contracts. You're trained in nuance. And that's rarer." "Why me?" "Because I've had 3 consultants and 2 professional interpreters look at this, and not one of them spotted what you would in 5 minutes. She crossed her arms, but her expression softened. "And if I say no? Then I'll leave the folder here anyway and trust you to decide." He didn't wait for her reply. He walked past her, headed to his office, and closed the door. Ava stood there for a long moment before stepping into the war room. The documents were dense but familiar international contracts, shipping routes, multi-party agreements with footnotes in legal French and engineering Mandarin. She sat quietly, pulled out a pen from her own pocket, and began marking the margins, not just correcting, refining, clarifying intent, flagging contradictions. She wasn't just translating, she was reinterpreting purpose. By midnight, she left the folder on his desk, closed with a single sticky note. "Your Cantonese is better than your French, but your German footnote is backwards." Julian found it at dawn. He read every mark, every line. His brow furrowed, then lifted, then remained still as realization sank deeper than pride. She had done more in one night than his high-level consultants had managed in weeks. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he waited until that evening. When Ava arrived, he met her in the lobby, dressed down, no tie, sleeves rolled, a paper coffee cup in one hand. "Walk with me," he said. "I'm working." "So am I." She hesitated, then pushed her cart aside and followed him toward the elevator. They didn't speak until they reached the rooftop terrace, a place few employees ever saw. The city stretched around them in a web of light and hum. "Why bring me here?" she asked. "Because it's the only place I come when I need to hear myself think." She turned to him. "And what are you trying to hear?" "The truth," he said. "Not in contracts or negotiations, just in someone's voice, someone who doesn't need to impress me." She leaned on the railing, fingers curling around the cool metal. "You still haven't told me what you want from me, Julian." It was the first time she'd said his name. It landed with more weight than he expected. "I want to know why someone who speaks 9 languages has spent the last year erasing herself from every room she enters." She didn't answer right away. The wind lifted strands of hair from her face. Finally, she said, "Because the last time I used my voice for something I loved, I lost everything. My future, my family's security, my sense of worth. So I stopped using it, except when no one's listening. But I am listening." She looked at him then, not as a boss, not as a man in a suit, just as someone standing in front of her with nothing rehearsed left to say. "You're not afraid of what I know," she whispered. "You're afraid of what I remind you of." "Which is?" "That power doesn't mean clarity, that knowing every number doesn't mean you understand people, that some truths don't come with data." He exhaled. "And what's your truth, Ava?" "That I'm tired of pretending I'm small just because the world doesn't know where to place me." They didn't touch, but something passed between them, an unspoken agreement that what had started as curiosity had become recognition, a moment not born from strategy but vulnerability. Julian stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of green in her eyes, the way her lashes trembled though her expression didn't. "I don't want to use you," he said. "I want to understand you." "Then don't ask me to perform." "I'm not. I'm asking you to lead." That night, he offered her a contract not as a janitor, not even as a translator, but as a confidential cultural consultant on international communications. She read it twice. "Why confidential?" "Because this isn't about credentials," he said. "It's about trust, and I don't want the world to interfere before you're ready." She looked at the paper, then at him. "If I say yes, what changes?" "Nothing," he said, "and everything." She didn't sign it then. She didn't even take the pen. But she folded the contract neatly, slipped it into her bag, and whispered, "I'll think about it." Julian watched her go, heart steadier than it had been in years, and understood something for the first time in a very long time. Power wasn't in commanding the room. It was in knowing when to be quiet enough to let someone else be heard. Ava didn't sign the contract the next day, or the day after. She carried it with her, folded neatly in the inside pocket of her canvas tote, its weight far heavier than the paper should allow. It wasn't hesitation, it was reverence. She knew what saying yes would mean, stepping out of invisibility, allowing herself to be seen not as a shadow passing through corridors, but as a voice worth listening to. And that terrified her more than any rejection ever had. Julian didn't press. He didn't follow up with reminders or updated terms. Instead, he kept showing up in small ways. A sticky note left on the supply cart that read, "Good luck," in 7 languages. A warm cup of chai on a cold night. No sugar, just how she took it. Once she found a thin, leather-bound volume of Rumi poetry on her mop handle, a ribbon marking a translated line. "The wound is the place where the light enters you." The next evening, she signed the contract. They began working side by side in the early hours, her notes peppered across foreign contracts. His comments left in margins, their handwriting slowly merging into one shared voice. They spoke less during those sessions, not because there was tension, but because words weren't always needed. He'd hand her a page. She'd glance once, nod, and rewrite an entire paragraph in silence. She'd pause at a term with no direct English translation, and he'd wait patiently while she scribbled its meaning across the edge of a napkin. When their eyes met, there was something heavier than admiration, something slower, softer, like the kind of familiarity that only grows when two people are no longer trying to impress each other. One night, after a 3-hour session revising diplomatic correspondence for a Southeast Asia deal, Julian leaned back in his chair and asked, "What language do you use when you talk to yourself?" Ava looked up from her notepad, blinking. "That depends." "On what? On whether I'm trying to comfort myself or judge myself?" He tilted his head, genuinely curious. "So what's comfort?" "Usually Italian. Everything sounds softer in Italian, even pain." "And judgment?" She smiled faintly. "English. Always English." He sat forward. "And when you think of love?" The air shifted. Ava looked down, pretending to brush graphite off the paper. "I don't know." "Never?" She paused. "I've studied how people say I love you in over 50 languages, but I don't think I've ever said it and meant it, so I don't know which one fits me yet." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I used to think love was efficiency, compatibility, timing, logic, until someone told me I love you in Russian and then sold me out 2 weeks later." Ava looked up, eyes softening. "So, now you don't believe in the words?" "No," he said. "Now I just want to believe the silences between them." She closed her notebook slowly. "You ever wonder what language your heart speaks when no one's listening?" He looked at her, really looked, like he was searching for something he didn't know he'd lost. "Maybe I stopped listening a long time ago. Then maybe that's why it stopped speaking." The rooftop became their sanctuary. On the nights they weren't surrounded by papers and contracts, they'd meet outside, Ava bringing leftover coffee from the staff lounge, Julian bringing music, low jazz, instrumental pieces, ambient strings. They didn't talk about work. They talked about childhood memories, strange idioms from obscure dialects, the loneliness of always being the smartest person in the room. Ava once admitted she sometimes forgot how to talk to people her own age. Julian told her he sometimes wished he could forget how to talk at all. It was there, under a sky just starting to bruise with sunrise, that Julian asked her something he hadn't asked anyone since his early 20s. "What was your first kiss like?" Ava blinked, caught off guard. "Fast. Wrong. It tasted like mint gum and insecurity." "Do you ever wish you could forget it?" "Sometimes, but mostly I wish my first kiss had been with someone who saw me." "And do you think," he said slowly, "that you'd know what it felt like now?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The pause between them was thick with unspoken answers. He didn't reach for her. He didn't move closer. But his voice dropped, just enough to feel intimate. "If I asked you to show me the wordless version, would you let me?" Her breath hitched, her fingers curled slightly on the paper cup in her hand. "I don't do almost, Julian." "Neither do I." He stepped toward her, not to take, not to claim, but to stand close enough that if she chose to bridge the rest of the space, it would be entirely hers. And she did. Slowly. Not because of impulse, but because of clarity. Her hand found his jaw, fingers tentative at first, tracing the edge of someone she had never imagined could be real in her world. He closed his eyes, letting her map him without resistance. When their lips finally met, it wasn't explosive. It was quiet, intentional, like two people finally speaking a language they'd both always understood, but never had a reason to say aloud. He kissed her like she was something to translate, not conquer. And she kissed him like she was finally allowed to believe someone was listening. When they parted, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "What language was that?" he murmured. Ava smiled. "One with no written form. You just feel it. I think I want to be fluent in it." "Then don't stop listening." That night, they didn't define anything. They didn't talk about what came next. They returned to their own homes, their own lives. But something had changed. The edges of their routines now curled around each other. His mornings began with her voice echoing in memory. Her nights ended with the echo of his name on her lips, unspoken, but known. And neither of them had to say it aloud yet. Because sometimes the most powerful kind of love begins not with declarations, but with understanding. The shift between them was subtle at first, just longer glances across conference tables, the way Julian would pause before opening a file as if waiting for her approval, or how Ava began arriving earlier, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The rooftop meetings continued, though they spoke less and listened more. It wasn't a secret, not really, but it was sacred, and they both moved through their days as if protecting something fragile the world might not understand. But the world was always watching. It started with a photo, grainy, taken from a high floor in a neighboring building, zoomed in just enough to catch two silhouettes on the rooftop of Ward International, one in a collared shirt, the other with hair tied in Ava's familiar braid. The headline was lazy but cruel. CEO spotted at midnight with mystery staffer scandal in the sky. At first, Julian ignored it. Noise. The press always sniffed for stories where none existed, but when it spread, when Ava's name appeared in anonymous comments, and her ID badge photo was posted alongside whispers of favoritism, backdoor promotions, and inappropriate relationships, he realized silence wasn't enough. His legal team advised immediate denial. His PR director drafted a statement. Ava, meanwhile, received a call from HR asking her to clarify the nature of her role with Mr. Ward. She found Julian pacing the boardroom, fists clenched at his sides, a red printout of the article crushed on the table. "I'm pulling it down," he said the moment she entered. "We're suing the source. I'll have the post scrubbed in under an hour." "It won't matter," she said quietly. "They've already seen it." "Then I'll speak. I'll go on record, say there's nothing inappropriate." "Julian, stop." Her voice was firm now, not soft or careful. "Don't spin me into a statement." He froze. "I know this company," she said. "I've walked its halls invisible for over a year. I know what they'll say. That I seduced you. That I traded languages for leverage. That I played the helpless girl for a title." "None of that is true." "But it doesn't have to be true. It just has to sound believable enough to stick." She crossed her arms, and her eyes, though calm, were pained. "I can't breathe under scrutiny like you can. I don't have your armor." Julian stepped toward her. "Then I'll shield you." "No," she said. "You can't." "Why not?" "Because it's not the world I'm afraid of. It's losing what made this real." He went still. "You mean us?" "I mean the part of us that existed before anyone else looked. Before it became something to explain or defend." Her voice cracked just barely. "If we turn this into something strategic, it stops being honest." He looked at her then, not as CEO or consultant, but as the woman who had once recited a Persian proverb to him in the dark, whose kiss had left a question lingering in his lungs. What if this is the only truth I've ever really needed? "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I need space, Julian, to remember who I was before this story stopped being mine." She walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind the article, the statement, the man who had always known how to control the narrative, but now couldn't speak a word. Over the following days, Ava's absence became a presence. Her office remained untouched, her notes unread. The communications team paused the Southeast Asia project she had been central to. Interns whispered. Executives speculated. Julian said nothing. He buried himself in data, schedules, silence. On the fourth day, he opened the roomy book she had once marked and found a new slip of paper inside. One line, in her handwriting, written in Icelandic. "Sometimes the quietest words are the ones we scream inside." He folded the paper once, then again, and put it in his jacket. And the next morning, she was gone. No resignation email, no formal goodbye. Just a deactivated badge and an empty desk drawer that still held a half-full box of green tea she used to drink at 2 a.m. Julian stood in her vacant space, staring at the mug she left behind, not chipped, not broken, just untouched, like her voice still echoing in the halls, in the spaces she had filled without ever needing to ask for room. He wanted to call, to chase, to send flowers or plane tickets or an apology in every language she'd ever taught him. But he didn't. Not yet. Because she had once said, "Don't fight for me until you've remembered who you are without needing me beside you." So he waited, with silence as his only company, and the ache of something real left unfinished, not because it wasn't strong enough, but because it wasn't yet ready to be heard. 3 weeks passed. It was just enough time for office gossip to settle into the quiet corners of the company, for her name to be removed from the staff lists, for everything to return to its polished rhythm, everything except Julian. He went to work every day, ran meetings, signed contracts, and replied to emails with his usual precision. But inside, the absence of Evelyn became its own presence. Every silent hallway reminded him of her voice. Every untouched coffee mug reminded him of what they never finished. He carried her absence like a language he'd never learned to speak, quiet but constant. Then one morning, in a downtown conference hall filled with diplomats and business leaders, he saw her. It was a United Nations Logistics Summit, an event he almost skipped, but something made him go. At first, he heard her voice not in conversation, but through a headset, crystal clear, confident, translating for the panel in real time. He turned toward the glass booth. There she was, seated at a microphone, wearing a headset, eyes focused and calm, every part of her radiating the quiet brilliance he had missed. Their eyes met through the reflection in the glass. It was just a second, maybe less, but it was enough. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. She just held his gaze, steady and unreadable. Julian didn't interrupt her work. He waited. After the final session, he left the main floor and stood just outside the hall, leaning casually against a marble pillar as delegates passed him by. She appeared 10 minutes later, walking with purpose, her badge swinging at her side, her coat folded over her arm. When she saw him, she paused. The crowd moved around them, but neither one noticed. "You found me," she said, her voice even, not surprised. "I wasn't looking," he said. "I just never stopped seeing you." There was a pause, not heavy, just meaningful. "How's the company?" she asked. "Efficient," he replied. "Busy, and a little quieter than usual." "And how are you?" He met her eyes. "Learning. Mostly about what I miss when I assume silence means indifference." She nodded slowly, folding her arms. "Why are you here, Julian?" "Because I realized something," he said. "For the first time in my life, I'm not trying to be understood by everyone. I only care about being understood by one person, and she's standing right in front of me." She exhaled softly. "You think words can fix what happened?" "No," he said, "but I think listening can. And I've been listening to what you didn't say, to what I didn't have the courage to hear before." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the same draft she once edited for him, the one filled with her notes in the margins, comments in different colors, thoughts scribbled in different languages. At the bottom, in his handwriting, he had added a single line. "She isn't just a translator. She is the message." She held the paper, unfolding it slowly, reading his words, and then looked back at him. "You know, I left because I was afraid I'd lose myself in your world," she said. "I thought if I stayed, I'd become a headline instead of a human. And I let you walk away," Julian said quietly, "because I didn't know how to fight for something without turning it into a strategy." But I'm not here to win, Ava. I'm here because I miss the sound of your voice, not when you speak, but when you think. And I want to be the person who never asks you to shrink again. She stepped closer, just enough that he could see the softness in her eyes again. Do you still believe in logic over love? No, he said. I believe in what I felt the night you stood on that rooftop and made me wish I could start over, and I still want to start over. With you. She glanced down at her hand, still holding the paper. And what would we call this? You and me? We don't have to call it anything, Julian said. Let it be what it is. Real. Ours. You hurt me, she said softly. I know. You also saw me when no one else ever did. And I still do. A long silence passed between them, filled with everything they had lived without saying. Then she smiled, small, honest. She slid the paper into her coat pocket. You've been practicing, she said. Not just words, stillness, reflection. And a little patience, he added, which I wasn't good at before you. He reached for her hand, not to pull, not to possess, but to offer. She took it. No rush. No dramatics. Just two people who had finally found the same page in a story they hadn't realized they'd been writing together all along. As they walked side by side through the glass doors and out into the city, Julian leaned over and whispered, I still want to learn your language. She glanced up at him. It was never about language, she said. It was about someone choosing to stay long enough to understand me without asking me to explain. Then let's make that our new language, he said, the one we don't teach, just live. And she nodded, not because she needed convincing, but because she finally believed it too. A year later, her name appeared on the speaker list for the International Conference on Language and Cultural Diplomacy, not as a translator, not as an assistant, but as a featured panelist. The session was titled The Unspoken Power of Silence in Multilingual Contexts, and it drew a crowd larger than anyone expected. When Ava took the stage, dressed simply but confidently, her voice didn't tremble. She began not with a greeting, but with a story, one about a girl who used to whisper in 9 languages when she cleaned empty boardrooms at night, not to be clever, but because that was the only way she still felt alive. She didn't name names, she didn't need to, but in the front row sat Julian Ward, notebook open, eyes steady, smiling like he already knew every word before she said it, and loved hearing it anyway. After the panel, she joined him outside beneath a wide awning where the city hummed beneath them. He handed her a small black notebook. Inside were pages filled with his handwriting, not business notes, but thoughts, questions, reflections, written in English, then rephrased in French, Italian, and even a few lines in Arabic. You kept studying, she said, flipping through the pages. Every day, he replied, not just to understand the words, but to understand how you move through the world with them. And what did you learn? That some people build their power by speaking over others, but you built yours by making space for voices no one else heard. She closed the notebook gently. That's the only kind of power I ever wanted. They didn't talk about the past much anymore. It wasn't because they'd buried it, it was because they'd outgrown the version of themselves that had been afraid to speak. Instead, they built something new. Julian restructured parts of his company, creating a foundation under Ava's direction that offered scholarships to students excelling in underrepresented languages. He gave up the corner office, moved into a smaller shared workspace beside her, claiming he worked better in rooms that didn't echo. They traveled together Geneva, Seoul, Casablanca, Rio, always splitting their time between work and quiet discovery. Ava kept a sketchbook filled with notes from people they met, phrases that couldn't be translated, emotions that had no direct definition but were felt just the same. Julian began collecting coffee mugs from every city, not because he drank more coffee, but because Ava smiled every time she saw a new one on his desk. They weren't married, not officially, but they shared a life more bound than any signature could promise. Their days were filled with little rituals, early walks where neither spoke until the third block, evenings where they read aloud in languages not their own, nights where they didn't need words at all, only presence. And when disagreements happened, which they sometimes did, they resolved them not by raising voices, but by returning to the rooftop with tea and time. On the anniversary of their reconnection, Julian surprised her. He led her to the top floor of a quiet building just outside the city. Inside was a space he had renovated for her, a library, a training center, a quiet sanctuary with walls lined in books and windows that opened to the sky. At the entrance hung a plaque that simply read, "The Ava Lynn Center for Quiet Language." Ava stood in the doorway for a long time, her eyes wide, her fingers trembling slightly as they grazed the frame. "You named this after me?" "I didn't name it," he said. "I recognized it." "Recognized what?" "That everything I've built since meeting you has been because I finally learned how to listen, and you were the first voice that ever made me want to." She turned to him, emotion rising in her chest, not heavy like grief, but full like spring water, pure, undeniable. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd matter like this." Julian stepped forward, cupped her face gently, and replied, "You didn't matter because I gave you space. You mattered because you never stopped creating it for others, even when no one gave it to you first." "So what happens now?" she asked, smiling through her tears. "Now," he said, "now we just keep building, one page, one word, one silence at a time." That night, they sat in the center's reading room, cross-legged on the floor with their backs against a bookshelf, reading poetry in a mix of languages, trading stanzas, correcting each other's accents, laughing at their mistakes. There was no press, no audience, no boardroom decisions, just them. A woman who once mopped the floors of his empire, and a man who once believed love was something you could negotiate. And in that moment, they both knew something deeper than happily ever after they knew peace. Because love, in the end, wasn't just what they had found. It was what they had created, a space where language was never used to prove worth, but to share it. And in a world obsessed with noise, they had found the rarest form of intimacy, the kind that speaks loudest when no one says a word.